Pharmacoepidemiology is a requirement for all programs that are in the designation for APA. And we are required to cover specific areas. And what I've discovered over the years in teaching this course is that a lot of people appreciate going back to basics. And so I revamped my slides a few years ago. So some of you who I know are active researchers or active in using biostatistics, this may be overkill for you, but my experience has been that the majority of students appreciate going back to basics. So these are some of the objectives that I've identified that I believe are useful for you in learning the methodology. How many of you are familiar with Bradford Hill criteria and causation? And you can just type it in, or just to give me a sense of what kind of audience I have here today. And if you've not ever heard of Bradford Hill, that's fine. It will gauge how I spend time with you on this material. And then we will talk about the epidemiology literature that's used in psychopharmacology. And, I have changed when this material is delivered to the Alliant MSCP program. I'm now giving it in the beginning of the first semester, basically, because for those of you who are not researchers, I've found that this material helps you in interpreting the literature better. For those of you who are already active in doing research, it might be something you're familiar with already. So these are the basic objectives that we'll go over. We may tackle a few other concepts as well. But these are things that are engaged in the requirements for the PEP exam as well as for program designation. So we're going to talk about different study designs, data sources, and confounding variables in epidemiology. Now, this is a joke. I'm not going to spend time reading it to you or telling it to you, but it's a great joke about the differences between different disciplines in medicine. So the surgeon, the pathologist, and the epidemiologist. And it really does give you a good sense of how different disciplines in medicine or in science approach the same questions. So I encourage you to go watch it when you have a chance. So I'm going to talk to you about basic study designs. I know that you're all familiar with these things, but it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And when you're doing epidemiology research, I'm very fortunate. I used to work at a law firm as a science advisor. And I got a chance to work with some amazing epidemiologists around the country. Janet Daling out of the Hutch in Seattle. Let's see, Dennis Deepin. Dennis is with the UCLA, a study on breast cancer in teachers. It's a longitudinal study that's been going on for a couple of decades now. Some folks from the Mayo Clinic. So I've really been very fortunate to get trained in the field of epidemiology with these folks. So just to go over the differences, and as you can see, I have different colors, but I also have different sizes in my font. So when you're asked a question about study design, what we're doing here is we're going from the weakest to the strongest study design that is available to us. So a case report, that's an observation, essentially. A case series is an observation of something that occurs more than once, but there's really no clear effort to control what you're looking at. A cross-sectional study will be a study that looks at everything that's happening at a given time. A case control study, now a case control study is something that you do want to be aware of in terms of the strength of the study design, but also if you're investigating or looking at a condition that your patient has, and it's a rare condition, you'll find that using case control study allows you to look at differences between two different populations that are essentially coming from the same place. And I'll go into that in more detail. And then we have the cohort study, and the cohort study is for epidemiology, and not so much for psychopharmacology, but for epidemiology in general. The cohort study is the gold standard for doing an epidemiology study. I'll talk to you about pharmacology standards and the kinds of study design that you use there. And I know that there are some questions on the PEP that have been designed to address these issues, so we'll make sure that you all go through it. Okay, so with a cohort study, what we have is the question of what will happen to me. And so think about the Harvard Nurses Study, the Framingham Cardiovascular Study, Heart Study. There are some very large cohort studies that are around the country and the world too. I mean, in Scandinavian countries, you have wonderful databases from Denmark, from Sweden, from Switzerland, because these countries have socialized medicine, so they have a lot of information about all of the population. And so they, from time to time, have generated very important findings. Now, we'll talk about controlling for error and bias. And the thing is that with a large cohort study, what you'll find is that because you have so many people in that study, you can see very small, statistically significant changes in your point estimate. And we'll talk about what that means. But so you can see a consistent increase in risk, let's say, or decrease in risk of 20%, but it's a strong and consistent finding, even though it's not a substantial increase. And we'll talk about what that means. But for now, cohort study, we call it what will happen to me study. I think these are the most useful ways to remember the different study designs. And so for a cohort study, you have subjects that are selected based on exposure. You have exposure that precedes the health outcome, and it's useful for common complaints. So anytime I ask you a question about a common condition, usually I'm going to be looking to use a cohort study to identify the characteristics in that study. So just hold on to that and remember that for later on. So the what will happen to me study, the cohort study, studies like the Harvard Nurses Study or the Teachers Breast Cancer Study out of LA, Los Angeles, those are cohort studies. They are large. They utilize a lot of patients or subjects, and they can go over time. Okay, so there's various benefits of having a cohort study. The thing with cohort studies, though, is that they take a lot of time and they take a lot of money. And so not everybody can do a cohort study or sustain a cohort study. The Mayo Clinic is one place that does. Harvard is another place that has done extensive cohort studies. If you're not familiar with the Harvard Nurses Study, I suggest you Google it because it's a remarkable database set where they've been asking nurses, I think it's maybe 40 years now, it could be more than that. And they have followed nurses over time and looked at a myriad of subjects or topics. They use that database for diet and nutrition. They've used it for, that's the study that was one of the first that came out to show that colon cancer is actually reduced in coffee drinkers, okay? So it's a study that can reveal all different kinds of information because it's been ongoing for so long and because they have a lot of time and they have a lot of money to dedicate to this the effort. Okay. So when we're talking about a common condition, and the common cold is one that I think of these days. Influenza seems to be quite common. I don't want to say coronavirus is common yet because that's a very scary prospect. But so if you have a common condition, so within the realm of mental health disorders, I think it's fair to say that mild to moderate depression, for example, can be considered a common condition. Now we can test for that, of course, to see how prevalent it is in the general community. And it may be more common in certain populations. But so when you're looking at a common condition, what you need to do is identify people in your population. If we're talking about a cohort study, people in your population who may or may not have that condition, so we can see how common it is. So the way we can select our subjects in a cohort study is either randomly or some other ways. So here I have my yellow women and my blue women. And if you sample randomly, you have the power to detect cases of the condition. So let's say here, if I'm just doing a random sampling, I've got 2 blue women, I've got a yellow woman, I've got another yellow woman, and then I've got a blue woman. So just by doing random sampling, because it's a common condition, and in a cohort study, which has lots of people in it, I am likely to detect that condition in my cohort, okay? So sampling is a major issue in terms of how you're going to look at a condition. So random sampling is one of the easiest ways. You can also use serial sampling. So if I say I'm going to study the first 500 people who respond to my questionnaire, in a common condition, if you just take the first 5, for example, you're likely to pick up the condition. So you can use, for common complaints, you can use either random sampling or serial sampling, okay? And this will come into play when we get to the psychopharmacology studies that are being done, have been done, where depending upon the size of the population or the sample that you're selecting, it's going to determine what kind of study design is relevant. So if you have a rare condition, it's much more difficult to detect cases. So here I'm comparing my, I've got mostly blue women, but I have a pink woman here, right? And so if it's a condition that does not happen as frequently in the general population, then I may not be able to detect it if I'm using serial sampling, right? So here I've sampled the first 5, the first 500, whatever. But because it's a rare condition, I may not be able to pick it up. So if you're looking at a rare condition, just remember this, that random sampling is not helpful, okay? It's possible, like if I did the last 5, I would pick up the one case, but the likelihood is that when you're sampling serially, that you may not have the power to detect cases. And so if you have a rare condition, it's what do you do? If you sample randomly, you may not have the power to detect cases either. So even though I'm doing random sampling, because there's only 1 out of 10 in this population or in the sample, I'm not going to be able to detect it. So what are you supposed to do in that case? You want to increase the N, right? So that's where our cohort studies come in. But even with a rare condition, here's my pink lady. I have 2 pink ladies in the whole population that I'm looking at. So even if I increase the N, it's still going to be very hard to detect 2 cases, okay? So here we've got some blue men, we've got orange ladies, blue ladies, we got everything in this population. And so to detect 2 cases, I would have to sample a population this big. And that's really not going to happen. Cohort studies cost money and time and money, right? And so the ability to detect an increase of one patient in your sample is just going to cost a lot of money. So what do? There is another design that we use, and that's the case control study. Now you all can identify case control study in the literature. I encourage you to do that, but there's a couple of things that you should know about case control studies. It's called the why me study. Why do I have this and my next door neighbor does not, essentially? So what we do is, because it's a rare condition, if we just are doing random sampling or serial sampling, we may not ever detect like a doubling of the cases. So what we do is we design a study so that we're comparing directly cases with controls, and we try to control parameters such as gender, age, ethnicity, things like that, to see if there is something different in the exposure of the cases versus the controls. So in a case control study, you have to have prior exposure in order to be considered part of the study, right? Because they only want to see how you differ from your neighbor, because and I'm using neighbor loosely. It can be other women in your age group. It can be men who have already had an elevated PSA. It can be various kinds of situations, but then you compare them directly, cases and controls, to see what differences there are between the two groups. And so in a case control study, you're comparing all of the orange people that are available. Those will be your cases. And you're comparing them to all the blue people, and that's the people who are your controls, okay? And by doing that, you eliminate the issue of being able to do serial or random sampling. You still have to identify, if you took the first 30 cases that walked into your office, did you use 30 cases from a defined time frame within your, within your study parameters? But basically what you do is you take groups that are as equal as you can in other factors like gender, age, etc., and you compare the two. And so that's the basic idea of a case control study, and we will give you examples of those going forward. I just have to drink something, so just give me 1 second. I'm going to mute myself for a second. Okay, sorry. Okay, any questions so far? I think you all know this. Maybe that some of you do, some of you don't. But let's go forward. So a cross-sectional study asks the question, am I like my neighbors? So you just want to compare. Here's a blue woman and a blue man, and you want to compare to see how do I fall into the grand scheme of what's going on in my neighborhood. So cross-sectional studies are easy to conduct. They don't allow for changes over time. So like in the case control study or in the cohort study, you can look at people over time. I think of the cross-sectional study as a snapshot of what's happening right now. So you assess everyone's health and their exposure simultaneously. You don't worry as much about the controls because you're asking everybody. So it's really a matter of, what do you look like, okay? And so a cross-sectional study, you'll capture all the pink ladies, you'll capture yellow ladies, if that's, let's say, osteoporosis. You'll capture men with, let's see, green, let's say prostate cancer. You'll capture the orange men who are depressed. You'll capture everything that's going on in your population at the same time. And so because of that, what happens is it's difficult to project forward as to what may happen in the future unless you can do that exact same cross-sectional study again. But in terms of giving you a quick image of where things stand, so let's say in, just take any population that you're interested about. Okay, so with coronavirus, you know, they have that, I don't mean to laugh, it's a horrible situation, but they have that cruise ship that's been sitting off the coast of California, and nobody knows exactly who's sick, who's not sick. So you could do a cross-sectional study of everybody on that ship, right? And you will pick up, let's say, the blue people or the people who were exposed to the coronavirus. If yellow people were not exposed, you know, they stayed in their cabin the whole time or something like that. And so that's a cross-sectional study. If you go in, you ask everybody the same questions at the same time, and whatever those results are, it will tell you, you know, it'll give you an indication of possible exposure information or contributing factors. Let's say women are getting sick faster than men. Well, you know, so that's something you'll pick up. You can't, you would then have to go forward and do an additional study to see if there's anything in their background that's going to explain why they got exposed, but that's essentially, you know, how you would use a cross-sectional study. Okay. So I'm going to jump into risk. You all know about the chi-square tables. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, except to say that what we are comparing usually with a chi-square table is it's binary, right? You either have the condition or you don't have the condition, and you either have the exposure or don't have the exposure. I'm going to be using these ABCDs in the next series of slides just to make sure that you see how we're using that information to calculate risk, okay? And by a show of hands, can you just let me know if you've ever done a risk assessment? Because that helps me know where you all stand on that. Okay, good. So I just like to make sure that I'm speaking to my audience, and so I like to gauge that. But it looks like enough of you are not familiar with risk assessment and calculating odds ratios or relative risk. So I'm going to go through this with you. So just keep, maybe if you've got paper next to you, just keep a running list on what A, B, C, and D is, so that we can explain it to you. And so I'm just going to write it down for myself. Okay. So when we're calculating relative risk, it's like, if you remember action potentials, right? I know you've not thought about action potentials in a while. But when you calculate, you know, the changes in voltage outside versus inside of the neuron, basically what you're doing is you're comparing, right? And so when we say that a neuron is hyperpolarized, it's relative to what's going on outside, right? So here, when we talk about relative risk, it's always in relation to something else, right? It's not just risk, it's relative risk. And so we're going to do comparisons between A and B, so everybody that's been exposed, versus C and D, everybody who has not been exposed. And by using chi-square table, you're essentially going to be comparing what happens when the relationship between exposure and having the condition, okay? So you can see that here, we're doing A divided by A plus B, and that is then divided by C plus D. So I will tell you that you're never gonna have to calculate this. I don't think we do it on the exam. And I know they're never gonna ask you to calculate it on the PEP exam. But what I can tell you is that they expect you to understand what relative risk is, okay? So I think I have an example later on in my slide set so that you all can kind of see how we go about calculating relative risk. But for most intents and purposes, I'm never going to ask you to do a calculation and come up with a number. I do expect you, though, to know that when we're calculating relative risk, that we're comparing the exposed group to the unexposed group, okay? And so...
exposed group is A and the unexposed.
Hold on a second. There's a recording. Hold on a second. I'm gonna... Oh, and I guess that recording is on the slides that I've given you, so that's good to know. I thought I had turned off all of those things. Yeah, good. All right. Okay. So when we just divide A by B, and then that by C and D divided by D, what we're looking at is risk ratio. And that's the incidence among exposed divided by the incidence among unexposed. So think about coronavirus, right? Every day we're hearing another 50 people died, another 100 people are in the hospital. Incidence, and we'll talk about incidence versus prevalence later on, but incidence is new cases, okay? So when we do a risk ratio, we're comparing those who were exposed and have the condition divided by those who were exposed but don't have the condition, and then everything divided by the unexposed and those who don't have it. Okay, so that's how you calculate a risk ratio. So far, just keep this in mind. We've talked about relative risk, and now we're talking about risk ratio. And I am going to tell you which parameter or point estimate we use depending upon what kind of study design we have, okay? So when I use the term point estimate, I'm talking about calculation, basically. So a mean is a point estimate. Risk ratio can be a point estimate. So it's just the measure that you're using at a given time is what point estimate means. And I continue to use that term throughout all my lectures, I think, today, but just to make sure that you understand what that is, because I know that's a term that not everybody is familiar with.
Judy, can I ask a question?
Sure.
On relative risk, A over A plus B, what is A plus B?
Hold on. So this is A, which is exposed and has the condition, divided by exposed and has the condition, plus exposed and does not have the condition.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
Good, thank you. And anytime you guys have questions, I'm very open to it. I may not always have the answer, but I'll do my best.
So C and C plus D are the same as that?
C is unexposed but has the condition, and D is unexposed and doesn't have the condition. Okay?
Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, so I am going through this a little quickly at this stage. I feel like, you know, you guys you've heard all of these terms. You may not use them, but you've heard them. So I am going a little quicker to get us to the meat of how we use these tools. And I think then it becomes very clear. So confidence intervals. I am going to screw with your heads. You've always seen confidence intervals expressed as P is less than 0.05 or P is less than 0.01. And in epidemiology, we use confidence intervals very differently. And so I'm going to force you to think about it in different terms. Hold on one sec. We're good. And so bear with me while I do that, but you do have to bend the way you think about confidence intervals a little bit when it comes to the epidemiology literature, because the assignment is going to include, and I have questions coming up that include understanding how confidence intervals are used. So think a little differently outside the box of what you learned in statistics in your graduate program or undergraduate, because it is slightly different, okay? So here's the punchline to everything you need to know about confidence intervals in epidemiology studies. If the confidence interval includes 1.0, then you do not have a statistically significant risk or odds ratio. We haven't done odds ratios yet, but we will. And I'm going to explain the difference between risk ratios and odds ratios. But the thing you need to practice in your head is that if 1.0 is included in the range of confidence intervals, then you do not have a statistically significant ratio, basically. So what that means is that if you have a risk ratio of 10, which is 10 times greater than 0, right? Or relatively speaking. But you have a confidence interval that includes 1.0. Even though your risk ratio is very high, you do not have a statistically significant ratio. I will illustrate this to you several ways, okay? But let's just talk about odds ratio first before I then demonstrate confidence intervals to you. So odds ratio, and I know you've seen odds ratios, hazard ratios, mortality ratios in the literature, and you may not have ever really thought about what that means. Odds ratio is the odds for cases divided by the odds for control. Risk ratio is the incidence among exposed divided by the incidence among the unexposed. So who can guess as to which one of these we use for a case control study? And the hint is kind of in the words that are used to define odds ratio and risk ratio. Anyone want to take a stab at that? It's okay if you don't.
Are you seeing the chat? That's where most people tend to reply.
I'm sorry, I can barely hear whoever that is, but the chat should be up. Oh, well, I guess no, I didn't give you the answer yet. Okay. So is there a problem though with the sound or with the access to the chat?
No, I was just saying that most people are responding in the chat.
Yeah, oh, there it is. It wasn't coming up. Okay. Yeah, so for whatever reason, I wasn't able to see that while I'm sharing. Okay. Well, good. Thank you. We got odds and risks. Okay.
We have lost your slides.
Yeah, I know, because I'm looking at for whatever reason, the chat does not come up when I've got my slides shared. So yeah, I'm going to pull the slides back up in a second. Don't worry, everyone. I want to read your answers. So it looks like most of us have gotten it correct. Okay, and we'll talk about that. But yes, whenever you're looking at a case control study, we'll talk about odds versus risk. I do want to introduce one more topic, and that is attributable risk. And this is related to causation issues. So if your risk ratio is greater than 2.0, that means that your risk is doubled, and it can be attributed to the exposure if your risk ratio is statistically significant and greater than 2. And I will give you examples of what that means. And so odds ratios are used for case control studies, and the hint was cases and controls are in the definition for odds ratio. And risk ratio is used for cohort studies, so exposed divided by the unexposed. Okay? So it's time for a break. I'm going to stop share so I can get my chat up. For some reason, I can't see it today. Here we go. Somebody had a question about Fauci. He warns to stay off airplanes and cruise ships. So could, Rebecca, what were you asking me to explain? I'm sorry. I didn't see it before. You might have been asking about using the cruise ship as a cross-sectional study. Okay, great, thank you. All right, I know we're on the clock and we had some technical problems, so we'll come back at the top of the hour, okay?
Yes.
Great. Mm-hmm. All right, so we were talking about odds ratios and risk ratios, and that odds ratios used for case control studies, risk ratios are used for cohort studies. Okay, so you can tell by the what's in the numerator and denominator what kind of study they're used for. And so this slide, I think, if you can't remember what these things are, it will help you remember. Okay? So I'm going to talk about confounding variables, just so that we're all familiar with. You are all familiar with confounding variables and bias factors. And in the field of psychopharmacology and pharmacotherapy in particular, there are often accusations that any study that's sponsored by a drug company has an inherent bias factor that influences the outcome of the data. I believe that there have been studies that look at that, and they have, you know, interesting point estimates to support that allegation. But there are many things that will affect the subjects. Recall is one of them. There's also experimenter bias, and the thought that financial support contributes to that is one that I know you're all familiar with. Selection. So as I said earlier, you can use serial or random sampling usually, but sometimes somebody who's doing a study might pick their sickest patients, for example, and then compare them to the healthiest people because they're trying to come up with some kind of statistical significance. So selection of the subjects is an important factor for you to consider when you're interpreting the data. Then motivation, somebody being paid to be in the study, that's another factor that often needs control. So there are other factors, gender, socioeconomic, ethnicity, things like that, age, and healthy worker. For those of you who work in the military, you know that everybody that is in active duty is usually in great physical shape. And so doing a study in active duty soldiers may be challenging because they're already healthy people, you know, and so they may not manifest a condition to the same degree as somebody who isn't in shape, for example. So these are just factors that we all have to take into account. Ethnicity, I think, is a really important one in terms of using pharmacogenomics. And so something that we try to control for. And that's based on behavior, of course, smoking, alcohol consumption. These are factors that what we do is we try to control for them as best we can. So when we're doing drug study designs, the gold standard is still randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, okay? So randomized sampling, so you know right there that you have lots of subjects because if you can randomize your sampling, then that means that you have a sufficient sample size that you can do that. Double blind, the person in the study and the experimenter don't know what the patient's getting, and then placebo controlled, so you can compare with placebo what the outcome is. And so this is our gold standard for drug study design. And okay, so here's a study that we'll walk through. It came out quite a few years ago at this point, but it's an interesting study. It looked at whether adjunctive risperidone treatment for antidepressant resistant symptoms in military service related PTSD, whether it has an effect or not. Oh, good. Now I'm getting it dropped into the chat. Still can't see it. Sorry, I gotta stop sharing. So, okay. Sorry. I've not had this problem to this extent before. It usually shows up. But, okay. So this is just to illustrate to you, a randomized controlled trial. They looked at SSRIs as being the only FDA-approved pharmacotherapy for PTSD. And so they wanted to see if for improvement of veterans with military-related PTSD. So they created a 6-month randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. They conducted it over a 3-year period at 23 different VAs around the country. They had 367 patients screened, and of them, 296 were diagnosed with military-related PTSD and had ongoing symptoms, despite having been treated with 2 different SSRIs, or SRIs as they say. So this is the study design. And so they did use, our gold standard randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. And so I wanted to illustrate to you what a study and study design like that is like. So they're giving 1 dose of risperidone or placebo. They're using CAPS as a measure for PTSD. They've got a depression scales, MADRS, and they did HAM-A. They didn't do HAM-D, but they used the Hamilton Anxiety Scale, so HAMA. And they used some other scales, the CGI and the RAND study for veterans. Okay? So here's the results. And this is where I'm going to illustrate for you how we utilize our confidence intervals just to tell us if we've got statistical significance or not. So this is CAPS scores. So they're looking at a change between they're looking at placebo versus treatment, but they're also, they're comparing baseline to 24 weeks, right? So the change in the score for the risperidone group was minus 16.3. So if it's going down, if their PTSD responses are going down, that shows improvement, right? And here's our confidence interval. And the confidence interval is negative because we're looking at the negative end of the scale, right? The change score is minus 16. So the confidence intervals are below 0, right? And here we see that they're 19.7 and 12.9. Okay. So they're both negative. So that says that it does not include 1.0. And if you remember what I said before, confidence interval including 1.0 is not statistically significant. So any confidence interval that is outside of 1.0 is statistically significant. So that is a statistically significant change from baseline to 24 weeks for the risperidone group in and of itself. And then, hold on one second. And then on top of that, when we compare the placebo group, and their decrease was 12.5, their confidence intervals are also statistically significant because they are outside of 1.0, right? So that's for the change in the inside each group. And then the main difference between the risperidone and the placebo group was 3.74, but look at my confidence interval. It includes 1.0. Oh, let me see, yes, because it's negative 0.86 to 8.35. So that includes the number 1.0, and my p-value is equal to 0.11. So even though we see improvements in both the risperidone and the placebo group, comparing them to each other on CAPS, there is not a statistically significant difference. Now let me see if I can pull up the question. I don't know why my screen is doing this. So sorry, I've got it up. So meaning greater than 0. So Maribel, just to be clear on what that means, it has to include 1.0. So if in this case, I just showed you, oops, sorry. In this case that I just showed you, comparing the risperidone group to the placebo group, there's no difference because it includes 1.0. Now, if this negative 0.6 was in fact positive, then it would have been statistically significant because it would have been greater than 1.0. Let me just see if I do this Alt-H. See if it's not working. So I see lots of comments. I don't know if it's because I'm on full screen or what, but I usually don't have this many problems with pulling up chat. So okay, good. So I think we're good. I lost it. Okay, so if it was 0.86, positive 0.86 to 8.35, you know what? It would not be, hold on. Yes, it would not be statistically significant. So thank you, Jason. You did get it. I said it backwards. So thank you for following up on that. It would not be statistically significant because it includes 1.0. Somebody trying to say something? Yeah, now I got the chat. Yes, thank you for catching that. And yeah, so you're not losing the slides when I have to go in and out to look at the chats. I just have to unshare. But I think we've resolved it now. Okay. All right, so good. Thank you for catching that. I was being a little dyslexic. So yes, so if it includes 1.0, it's not statistically significant. And here we've got negative 0.86 to 8.35, so that is not statistically different. So then they did a mixed model analysis. I don't know if I'm going to have time to talk with you about different kinds of scattergrams and things like that, but we'll see. I might have some time towards the end. In my last slide set, I think I go into some of that detail. So anyway, but regression analysis and stuff like that. So, so mixed model analysis of all the time points, and not just comparing baseline to 24 weeks, showed no significant difference in CAP scores. So that means that both the risperidone and the placebo group improved similarly. And again, look at my confidence intervals here, 64.7, so to 69.62. Let me see. So for risperidone alone, it was statistically significant. Let's see, risperidone means 64, confidence intervals. Yep. So, so depending upon what kind of analysis, but here's the p-value, that's what I was looking for. The p-value, comparing the two groups at all time points, confidence interval of negative 0.74 to 6.2, okay? So that's the bottom line, that at all those different time points, for the CAPS score was not different between the two groups. Risperidone did not reduce symptoms of depression using MADRS, and there you have your, again, your confidence intervals, right? Or anxiety using the HAMA. And so, and then basically none of the comparisons between risperidone on these measures was statistically significant. Here we have observer-rated CGI mean difference. So we do have a comparison that was statistically significant, but most of the parameters were not. So this is basically how you use your confidence intervals and your point estimate, whether it's a comparison between the scores or whatever it is that you're using, to tell you whether there's statistical significance or not. Okay? And then here we did have more adverse reactions to risperidone versus placebo. So we had weight gain that was statistically significant, fatigue, sleepiness, and hypersalivation. Sorry. So the general conclusion was that among patients with military-related PTSD, with SRI-related resistant symptoms, SSRI, 6-month treatment with risperidone compared to placebo did not reduce PTSD. So to me, what this study says, that placebo is as effective as risperidone in decreasing the CAP score, right? And so I had this conversation with people, and we're going to address it. I'm going to give you the various kinds of study designs that are used for drug studies. And you'll see that there are many different kinds of placebos that you can have. So in this case, they probably compared risperidone to taking the pill, right? So they gave the patients a pill that looked the same. And there are other kinds of placebos. You can have a positive placebo, which would be another antipsychotic, right? Or an antipsychotic that is shown to have a positive effect on PTSD performance. So, and we'll talk about those different kinds, but basically placebo, if placebo is working, then use placebo. Somebody have a question? No, no. All right. So I'm going to talk about some more of the specifics regarding study designs that you're going to see in the drug literature, as well as definitely on the PEP. I promise you there'll be a study on crossover design, so be familiar with it. So a crossover study, and you're all familiar with this, I think, is when all patients from a population are initially assigned to one of two groups, one group who gets exposed to the intervention, or a second group that does not get exposed to the intervention. After some time, an evaluation of the outcome is done, and the patients from both groups then undergo a period of washout. So you have to know what your half-life is of the drug, if there's any physiological factors that are going to affect the pharmacokinetics of the drug. You need to make sure that all drug is out of that person's system, and then they get the opposite treatment. So if they had gotten placebo to begin with, then they'll get the medication. If they got medication to begin with, then they will get the placebo. And so once that washout period takes place, then that's when we get our crossover, okay? And the study design provides the advantage of reducing the variability in outcome measures from outside confounding variable, because each patient is their own control. What it doesn't control is repeated sampling, right? Repeated testing. So if you're using the same scale, point estimate, for the pre and the post, then the patient has more experience with that testing when they get the second treatment, okay? So that's one factor that can confound a crossover study design. This is the design itself. I'm just going to take a sip of water. So mute you for a second. And so here's our population, and we're going to divide them, and it can be randomly or however we want, into exposed subjects versus unexposed subjects. So this is your first study group. And then we further divide that group into those who have the outcome and those who do not have the outcome, okay? And that's true for the unexposed group as well as the exposed group. And then what we do is we flip, we have our washout period, and then we flip, and now the unexposed group will be exposed, okay? And vice versa. The ones that were exposed first get exposed again. And that's a basic format for a crossover study design. There are factors. I think this slide's slightly different than the one you have, but it's basically the same topic. So a crossover study design reduces the influence of confounders because the patients serve as their own control. It reduces variability in the outcome being measured and increases the precision of estimating, okay, of estimation. So it reduces variability in the performance. You can have smaller sample sizes, and you have the opportunity for the patients to receive both treatments, which is attractive to some subjects. So they don't want to be in the placebo group. If their mental health disorder is that bad that they're, willing to be in a study, they want to get the drug. They're hoping that that drug is going to affect them. And we will talk at length when we get to the depression slides about that concept of confounding variables influencing performance with placebo, as well as breaking the blind for drugs, for the drug group. So here's a bunch of limitations. I don't know that I'm going to read all of these to you, but I do want you to understand that, as I mentioned before, you're going to have carryover effects that we assume don't exist, but they probably do. It may take longer than a randomized clinical trial since patients have to have that washout period, and you can be subject to period effects where differences in the effectiveness of an intervention can occur over the passage of time. These are some examples of those things, but point out dropouts, because when we talk about the STAR-D trial, we need to talk about dropouts in terms of interpreting STAR-D. That's when we get to the depression slides. So I just want to point out to you that FDA regulations, here's the CFR, they have 5 different kinds of controls that are recognized by FDA. And so one is the placebo concurrent control, and that's the one that we typically see. Dose comparison concurrent control, so you can see if there's a dose response curve. No treatment concurrent control, active treatment concurrent control, and historical control. So these are the 5 kinds of controls that the FDA recognizes for studies. Now, this is a long slide. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but the placebo control, no treatment control, and dose comparison control studies are design studies that have differences that are intended to show an outcome, right? So you're trying to tease out an outcome that may be easier to see when you add in dose comparison controls. The alternative design study is used in studies that have an active treatment concurrent control, where there's a finding of no difference between the drug and the recognized effective agent, and can be considered evidence of effectiveness of the new drug. So that's that positive placebo kind of that I was talking about before. And then our active controls are often used in antibiotic trials because it's easy to tell the difference between antibiotics that have an expected effect and those that don't. And so that's, again, you're going to have that comparison to your standard or your gold standard of that drug class. Okay? So in some cases, the active control design is simply incapable of allowing a conclusion as to whether or not the test article is having an effect. So there's some negative aspects of it. And so, you know, this is really information for you to be more familiar with these different kinds of controls. You can overcome some of the problems by increasing sample size. You can overcome just about any problem with increasing sample size, but of course then you're talking about money and time, right? But anyway, so you do have limitations for these different kinds of placebos or controls that we offer. And so you should be familiar with those differences. Here's our placebo concurrent control. The test drug is compared with an inactive preparation that's designed to resemble the test drug, right? So that's where they're given a pill that looks the same, essentially. A placebo-controlled study can include additional treatment groups, and so can have an active treatment control or a dose comparison control, usually using randomization and blinding. So when we talk about a placebo concurrent control, that's essentially, it can be any other of these factors that are included. We can also have a dose response concurrent control. So when they say concurrent, it's basically just that it's being done simultaneously with the drug treatments, okay? And then, let's see, so randomized fixed dose response trial. The subjects are randomized to one of several fixed dose groups. So you can have low dose, medium dose, high dose, and then the subjects can either be placed on their fixed dose initially, or be raised to that dose gradually. So you can start them out at the low dose and work their way up, or they can just be given a individual dose. Okay? Dose response trials are usually double blind. They can include a placebo and or active control, right? So you can give a 0 dose of the drug, or you can have any of our active controls. Then you have in a concentration control trial, so that's essentially dose response. You can have them titrated to several fixed concentrations, okay? So in a regimen controlled trial, subjects are randomized to 2 or more regimens of the studied drug. So it can be once or twice daily, 3 days versus 7 days, however you want to do it. So just be familiar with the fact that there are these different kinds of controls and what the difference is. Now, if you have a huge cohort study, you can have external controls, often called historical controls. So if you've been studying the same thing over and over again for years and years, but looking along an extended time course, for example, then you can use an external control. Or, for example, the NHANES study. There are all these different studies that are run, the STAR-D trial, BD steps. These are all different kinds of trials that exist to study mental health disorders. And so they do have historical controls because their longitudinal studies are going on for long periods of time. So you may see those historical controls used in an ongoing basis if you're looking at a new drug or you're looking at a different dose or different delivery system. That's where you may see a historical control being used. Okay. Let's see, so-called baseline control studies in which subject status on therapy is compared with status before therapy. And this is using physiological parameters where you have no internal control and are thus uncontrolled or externally controlled. So that's one of the limitations of using that kind of study. I do want to talk to you about split plot design. So this is another design that I expect you to know for the PEP, for my exam. The split plot design is used a great deal because it enables you to cover a common case in the real world when you have a factor that you want to study but can't change it as often as your other factors. And so here's an example. This is an animal model. The split plot design, you're looking at the effects of 2 diets and vitamin supplement on weight gain in rats. So the rats are housed 2 per cage. So they're all eating the same food. The cages are randomly allocated to diet A or diet B, and individual rats color marked, randomly selected to receive vitamin or not. So this is just, here you have cage 1. One animal is getting the vitamin, one is getting the same food but without the vitamin. Here's cage 2. So that's where the pairing of 2 animals per cage. So that's how we divide it up. And so this is the general split plot design where for every individual who's getting treatment, you have an individual that's not. So you kind of follow them along as paired control and case, okay? So I'm going to get back to Bradford Hill. I asked about Bradford Hill before. When I worked at the law firm on medical devices and pharmaceuticals, our firm represented Eli Lilly, a number of drug companies, and also Bristol Myers Squibb, and also medical device manufacturers. So I had to get engaged with material science and polymer science and a lot of really different diverse areas. And cancer and other disease states, autoimmune conditions. So it was an interesting experience. Certainly I spent 10 years doing that. And so that's where I first learned about Bradford Hill, and that Bradford Hill is a criterion that you can use to assess whether a condition, even if you don't have an attributable risk, as we talked about before, of your point estimate, your risk ratio being greater than 2, it is a way that we can assess causality. In your field, it will be, and there's a random question, but SSRIs. SSRIs, as you know, have very high pKa's, right? SSRIs typically have a pKa that's above 9. And so what organ system in the body has a pH that's equivalent to that, right? Because when you have pKa and pH, 50% when they're equal, right? So let's say you have a pKa of 9.5 and you're in a tissue that has a pH of 9.5. At that stage, half of your drug is ionized, half of your drug is non-ionized, right? So half of your drug is going to go through the membrane, whatever organ system that is. There's really only one biological compartment that has a pH around 9.5, and that's bone, right? So when we're administering systemically, right, you ingest an SSRI that has a pKa of 9.5, are you somehow getting SSRIs into your bones? So that would be the hypothesis. And if you look at the literature, there's some literature that suggests that SSRIs can be taken up into bone tissue. Now, is that a causal relationship? Is there a relationship with osteoporosis or any other kind of bone condition, right? If there is it a causal relationship or is it just an association? So that's where Bradford Hill criteria come in. I wanted to make sure that everybody who I talk to understands correlation versus causation. So just because you have correlation does not imply causation. And remember that, okay? So I'm going to talk to you about HRT and coronary heart disease as an example, because there was a big scare back in the 90s, the early 2000s, that women who were taking HRT had an increased risk of coronary heart disease. And this came out, there was a large cohort study that looked at this question. This quote here is from the commentary on that study. Does hormone replacement therapy cause coronary heart disease? And so the title is this the death of observational epidemiology? So numerous studies had shown that women who were taking combination HRT also had a lower than average incidence of coronary heart disease, leading doctors to propose that HRT was protective against it. However, randomized controlled trials showed that HRT caused a small but statistically significant increase in risk of CHD. So the first part was based more on, cohort studies, things like that. And then when randomized control trials were done, they found that there was a statistically significant increased risk in CHD. So reanalysis of the data showed that women taking HRT were more likely to be from higher socioeconomic groups with better than average diet and exercise. So the use of HRT and decreased incidence of CHD were coincident of a common cause, so higher socioeconomic status rather than cause and effect as had been supposed. Okay? So I know it's a little complicated, but women were running around going to their doctors trying to get off HRT because these randomized control studies suggested that they were at increased risk for coronary heart disease. Okay? So was it a correlation or an association, or was it causal? And so these authors are suggesting that it had more to do with the confounding variable of higher SES that was responsible for that change that people were attributing to the drug, to the hormone. Okay, let me just take a sip of water and get through Bradford Hill if we can. Sorry. Oops. My slides jump sometimes, so forgive me for a minute. Okay. So if you have not heard of Austin Bradford Hill, he became Sir. He was knighted. But in 1965, he published an article, The Environment and Disease, Association or Causation. He gave the presidential address to the Royal Society of Medicine, and he presented a systematic approach based on scientific judgment to infer causation. So he was using it to establish a relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And he came up with 9 principles. There's sometimes 10, but basically a series of principles that you use to test whether there's evidence of causation. And it's called the Bradford Hill criterion. And so we used to use the Bradford Hill criteria in court as whether you can claim a causation or not. You know, there's a lawsuit, usually to get to clients like who are in the Fortune 40 list, there have to be a lot of them. And they're all claiming that they are getting headaches when they take this medication, and they were never warned about it. And so a Bradford Hill criterion assessment is done, a risk assessment, to determine whether exposure to that drug is in fact a causal factor in having headaches. Okay? So these are the factors. Temporality. Were you exposed to the drug before you had headaches or after you had headaches, right? So if you're looking at your patients and they're all coming in complaining of headaches, you're going to think, oh, maybe this drug is causing their headaches. But you have to look back and see if the headaches were before the exposure to the drug. And believe it or not, in some mass tort litigation, they claim that exposure, you have to be exposed in order to have the symptoms that they're claiming. And so basically, there's no way to control for that, because if you have to be on the drug or have the medical device in order to claim a causal relationship, there is no temporality. So you do not get off the dime, so to speak, with the Bradford Hill criteria. You have to have had exposure before the symptoms appeared, okay? Strength of association. And there are several Bradford Hill criteria that do overlap, but for strength of association, is your point estimate a big number, like 50, or is it a small number like 0.2? If you have a small but statistically significant increase, that has less strength of association than if you have an odds ratio or a risk ratio of 50, okay? So how strong is the association between your cases and controls or in your cohort study? Dose response relationship. Now we do know that there are some paradoxical effects of drugs like with opioids and hyperalgesia, right? You, at low doses and high doses, you see one effect. At middle doses, you don't. It's the opposite. So we have adjusted over the last 60 years a little bit in relying on dose-response relationship, but typically you expect to see a dose-response relationship of some kind. And so are lower doses causing less of the complaint or associated with less of the complaint, whereas a higher dose, you see more of the complaint. That's dose-response relationship. Plausibility. I worked in breast implant litigation, and this one goes with, you can sometimes call it bioplausibility. And there were a couple of scientists who were claiming that they could see crystalline silica in the breast tissue of women with breast implants, and that the silicone, which is inert basically, was being converted to crystalline silica, not just silica, like amorphous silica, but crystalline silica. And there is no plausible way that that would happen in the body. There is silica in the shell of breast implants, but it is amorphous. It's not the form that is dangerous to your health, crystalline silica. So there was no bioplausibility for this proposal that women with breast implants were developing silicosis as a result of having breast implants. So you have to have a plausible explanation for what is being claimed. If you have a patient, they take your antipsychotic and they get a hangnail, right? There is no plausible reason to think that that is being caused by the antipsychotic. So you have to have a plausible pathway to explaining how this relationship could be causal. Consistency. If there's 20 studies that have been done on the question and 19 all give you the same result and one doesn't, that's considered consistency. But if you're looking at a meta-analysis that has included all kinds of studies, it can have case control, case series, cohort studies, and you have 50% that show one thing and 50% that show another, that is not consistency, okay? You really have to have a body of evidence that supports the association to get to the Bradford-Hill criterion, and specificity. And in the breast implant litigation, we had claims that silicone was causing scleroderma, that it was causing arthritis, that it was causing breast cancer. In fact, there were like 15 epidemiology studies that all showed that women with breast implants actually had a lower risk for breast cancer. Now, we're not saying that breast implants cause that lower risk. We were saying that there might be factors that influence a woman with small breasts seeking out breast implants. And so there might be a healthy, a healthy patient population or something like that. But you have to be specific. You can't say that your drug is causing hangnails, headaches, GI upset, all these different things. There has to be a specific or a demonstration of a specific effect, that the drug does this or the drug does that. Okay. And so coherence. If the data, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about STAR-D trial, but in the STAR-D trial, they had to change the assessment that they use, HAM-D, in order to see statistical significance in the STAR-D trial. And so was there a coherent story or approach taken? If you're changing the way you do your analysis and it's true, that's not as coherent as if the same parameters are used throughout all the studies. So that's coherence in essence. Then testability. So can you test a hypothesis? If you can't, then you don't meet Bradford-Hill criteria. You have to be able to do a comparison or to do an evaluation to confirm the claims. And then alternative causation. So are there other explanations that would be more appropriate for what you're proposing as a causal relationship? Are the women also taking an NSAID with their medication, that combination might be causing the headaches? Okay. All right, so just to conclude, association does not prove causation. Anecdote does not equal evidence. A hypothesis is not evidence. Okay, so we are on the mark for our 10-minute break, right? It's not much time there yet, is it? Right, we have 1 more hour to go before lunch, I think. So, can somebody confirm that? So here's some conclusions that I have. I have some questions. Okay. So epidemiology is like a street lamp. You can use it to illuminate your findings, or you can lean on it for support. I have some questions. So I guess we'll do these questions at the top of the hour. How does that sound? Okay. All right. I'll see you back here in 10.
It would be okay that I run the attendance right now.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, give it a few more seconds and close the poll.
everybody back? Great. Okay. So Aiden, can I close this polling screen? I wasn't sure if I should close it or you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it has already been closed.
Oh, it's still on my screen, so that's why I was asking. Okay, so we're going to do a brief review here, and then we'll move on to the next set of slides, where we'll talk about incidence and prevalence and things like that. Okay. So the first objective was to be able to list and compare study designs, data sources, and confounding variables. Can you list the different types of study design in increasing order of strength? So starting from the study design that's the lowest, going up to the highest. So you can just, anybody can type it in. What's the study design that is at the bottom of the pile where it's basically an observation? It's from one of my earliest slides. Case report, good, thank you. Okay. And then, there we go. Heather's got it all. Case report, case series, cross-sectional, control study, cohort. Okay. So this isn't one of the questions that everybody has to answer. We have those coming up though. So here we go. Cross-sectional, case control, and then cohort. Good. Thank you. Now, this one, so Aiden, do we have the poll for this? Okay, everybody. So there's the poll. What is the best study design to use if you wish to study the effect of vitamin C on common cold symptoms? And you do have to answer these questions to get CE credit. So please be sure to participate if that's your plan. Okay, a few more of you. Otherwise, we're going to stop the question. And let's see, there's 25 people logged in, only 22 have answered. But okay, so the majority of you put cohort. Can you guys see the results?
Judy, would you like me to end the poll, or you can also end the poll on your
Okay.
side and share the result?
Okay, here we go. So now they can see it. There we go. Okay, so the majority of you said cohort study, which was the correct answer. So good job on that. Okay, and I refer back to those slides. Okay. So Aiden, can you bring up the next question for me? Both serial and random sampling may be used if you are studying common symptoms. Is that true or false? The majority of you got it correct. And you can use either kind of sampling method for common symptoms. Okay. And then here's, I think, one more or two more questions. Serial sampling does not have sufficient power to detect cases of rare conditions. Is that true or false? Okay. So here's the results. Very good, everybody, for the most part. And that's why we have our case control design, right? Okay. Here's a question. The double-blind placebo-controlled design in psychopharmacology research has been criticized because reports of side effects may clue clinicians to the experimental status of the patient. Placebos are too variable. Clinicians may subtly convey to their patients their expectations for improvement, depending on whether the patient is receiving experimental drug or placebo. Patients become aware of their experimental status because placebos have no side effects. And Najib is asking where the poll is. Oh,
Well,
good.
if someone don't see the poll for whatever reason, either they're using their iPad, iPhone, or elsewhere, you can just answer inside the chat.
Okay, but I think he found it. So good. Sometimes it's just a little pop-up box and we have a lot of other things open. You don't see it. Okay. We have a lot of variability on this one. The first one was the best answer. Reports of side effects may clue clinicians to the experimental status of the patient. Although I think in and of itself, this is a controversial question because it's true that if experimenters or clinicians see adverse reactions in patients, that they assume that that patient is getting the drug, not the control. Excuse me. But in fact, placebos do have side effects. I mean, if I am telling somebody, you're gonna, this pill improves your mental state, blah, blah, blah. And I then tell you that it has been associated, or some patients have complained of this or that. That's the nocebo effect, right? Nocebo. That is nocebo. And so I expect patients who are getting placebo to also have adverse reactions that if they've been told that they exist. So, the first one's the correct answer, the most accurate answer. And what I wanted to show you is that this question is actually from a PEP exam, practice exam. So it is a question that, I don't know if you'll see this specific question, but you might be asked questions like this. And that's why I like to incorporate it into the discussion about placebo. That is the older version of the PEP exam, but still. Okay, so just for your own edification, think if you can describe the concept of causality and the difference between causation and association and correlation. You don't really have to type that in. I just want to make sure that you think about that, right? And then can you give 2 examples of the concept that correlation does not imply causation? So you can type that out if you want. I mean, blonde hair, blue eyes, and there's lots of them, but I'd like for you to think about what the difference is between correlation, and causation. Okay. All right. So now I'll give you some questions. List and interpret the Bradford Hill criteria. We're not gonna do that together, but it is the objective, so you can think back. If anybody wants to type in a couple of them that you would recall offhand. Okay, cool. Geraldine, I just saw your comment there. Nocebo is a major problem, and you know, it's curious that experimenters would not expect to see nocebo. I would definitely expect to see it. Okay, so anyway, I just want to make sure that you can list and interpret the Bradford Hill criteria. Maybe like apply it to something like QT interval and you know, any of your antipsychotics or your antidepressants that are associated with QT interval, or the example I gave you before with SSRIs and bone density. You know, would that meet Bradford Hill criteria? So just for your own exercise to be able to identify what they are and how they contribute to including a causal relationship. Okay, so here's a question for the poll. Hayden, if you could bring it up. Meeting all of the Bradford Hill criteria supports a conclusion that a factor has a causal association with a disease. True or false? Okay. Oh, good. More people are there. Okay, so the majority of you got that correct. And it's really only all of the criteria. You can't meet half of them and say that you have causation. So it's really You have to have all of them to have that cohesive picture of causation. Okay, and then objective 4 was calculate rates and risks. As I said, I'm not expecting you to do that, but I think I might have a couple, 1 or 2 questions that ask about, is this risk greater than the other or something like that. So you will have to remember A, B, C, D, okay? And you do need to remember if it's a case control study, what kind of point estimate we have versus a cohort study, and what kind of point estimate we have. Okay? Okay. So here's a question. The odds ratio is calculated as 0.9 with confidence intervals of 0.89 and 0.99. Is your odds ratio statistically significant? Okay. I think everybody's on here, and this is a case where the majority is not correct. Okay. And the odds ratio of 0.9 with confidence, oops, that's the question. Okay, there, that's the question. Now I gave you the answer to the second one. But this does not include 1.0, right? 0.99 is below 1.0. So all right, so the odds ratio is calculated as 0.9 with confidence intervals of 0.7 and 1.1. Is it significant, statistically significant? Yes, Angela, it was the wrong question. I think I showed you the answer, so I kind of expect you guys to get it right. Okay. Still a mixed bag of results, but I think some of you are getting this. Correct answer is no. And between 0.7 and 1.1, 1.0 falls in there. So if 1.0 is included, in the confidence intervals, you do not have statistical significance. Okay? All right, we're getting the hang of it. Here's our next one. The risk ratio is the point estimate used for case control studies. Is that true or false? Okay. The majority of you said true. And actually false. I'm on the right question, right? Risk ratio is a point estimate used for case control study. Does anybody remember the name of the correct name of the point estimate for case control studies? Well, odds ratio, right. And Brady, you're correct that cohort is, this is the right point estimate for cohort. So good job. Okay, so let's go to the, I think there's one more. Okay, so this is our study that we looked at before, the risperidone and PTSD study. I'm just going to move that over to this slide. And these were the results. And based on the confidence intervals, can you conclude that there is statistically significant mean difference? And for the comparison that I'm looking at here, okay, on the screen, it's in yellow. We're missing a few more people. Okay, good. Okay, so the majority of you said no. Good. Correct answer is no, right? And I think most of you are getting it at this point, that if 1.0 is not included in the range, well, if it is included in the range of the confidence intervals, then you do not have statistical significance. Okay, so good job. All right, let's see. So now we're looking at Well, I think this is just to illustrate that there was not a difference. Okay, so that's the end of that slide set, and I'm going to pull up the second slide set. I think it's whoops. Just happened, I lost the bottom of the screen. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and let me open the next slide set. I will share in a minute with you all. Any questions about what we've covered so far? It's pretty basic stuff. I know you've heard about this all the time. And now, hopefully, for those of you who aren't familiar with methodology and statistics, that you're more comfortable now. And if not, we'll get you there. So, oh, I've lost all. I don't know why this happens. I think it's specific to my screen because it's a small laptop. And I'm looking to get a new one. All right, so everybody see my slides? Slide set 2. I got this poll in. Oh, good. I can at least see your chat. Good. Thank you. All right. So we're going to move on now to, well, we've done some calculation of risks, and we're going to move on to more discussion of that. And we're going to speak specifically about prevalence, incidence, and risk assessment. I'm going to jump to the punchline. Incidence, if you remember what I said before about the coronavirus issue, incidence is the number of new cases within a given time. So I don't know if you all heard that Italy is basically shutting down and quarantining Milan, Florence, or I don't know about Florence, but Venice. They're just shutting down the towns. Nobody can come in, nobody can go out. And that's because their incidence rate, which is the new cases, every day they have people dying from coronavirus. So that's the new cases is what incidence is. Prevalence is how many cases exist right now, whether they're new or old. Okay, so here's prevalence. A is the total number of cases of the risk factor in the population at a given time, divided by the number of individuals in the population. So this is your total population, A plus B. And then that is, well, A is divided by that. So the number of people that are cases, essentially, divided by A plus B. And this is just one example of an interesting study that had been done a few years ago now, prevalence and risk factors of maternal depression during the first 3 years of child rearing. And I've cut most of it out. It's really just to show you, there's a longitudinal study. So that means that they have a cohort that they're looking at, and they use the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development study on child care and youth development. So that's a cohort that's been established by the government, and they analyze that data to look at, over time, maternal depression status. Let's see, and so they had a scale that they used for depression, and it was defined as a score greater than 16. For this study, early onset depression was defined as depression within, I'm sorry, it's cut off. I think it's 3 months, but I could be wrong, but you're not going to get tested on that. And I give you the resource for the article if you'd like to look at it. But here's the results. The prevalence of maternal depression was 32.2 for early onset, 7.4 for late onset, and 13% for chronic depression. Okay, so what they looked at is all the cases of maternal depression. And they looked at it on a time scale, right? But it wasn't new cases versus old, it was just all the cases. And that's kind of the point I want to make. And they don't give the statistics. So whenever a paper says a higher prevalence and doesn't show you the confidence intervals, I count that as not statistically significant, okay? Just so you know. If they don't have the courtesy to give you the data, then it is either because they don't want to admit that they didn't have statistical significance, or they just haven't bothered. But for you, as somebody reviewing the literature, I want you to always look for confidence intervals. Many journals require that now. So, okay. So here's incidence, and that's the number of new cases occurring in the population in a given time period. So for coronavirus, it's every day, right? Number of new cases today. I heard that at one point they were reporting the numbers and cases were coming in as they were reporting it. So they would say 7 people dead, 8 people dead, 9 people dead, all within that day, right? So this is the measure of the risk of developing some new condition within a specified period of time. So whenever you see incidents, now you have to assume that people know what they're talking about, but incidence is specific to new cases that have appeared. Okay. And here's some other definitions of incidence, just more words that say what I just said. So it's usually a head count, so the number of people who develop the disease per unit time. It's always going to be according to how, a day, a week, a year, whatever you're looking at. But it's always going to be defined by a time period. It can be 22,000 deaths in 2019, something like that, okay? And here's these definitions come from the government. Oh, and just so you know, that's the Board of Labor Statistics, okay, which we're going to look at now. You can actually go in, plug in data, and calculate the incidence rate for given exposure or injury or whatever. This is for injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. And it's under Bureau of Labor Statistics so that people can look up how dangerous is this job, right? And so you put in the number of hours that people worked in a given year, right? You're going to put that number in there. And then you're going to put in the total number of non-fatal work related injuries, days away from work, number of cases involving job transfer or restricted work activity only. And that way you can make these calculations. You have to put in the time, right? I said time before. And then they'll give you that answer for your factory. I don't know how many of you deal with occupational injury or not, but it's a major, especially with mental health disorders, right? It's a major issue for employers. Am I hiring somebody who is going to be able to make it to work every day? Am I hiring somebody who's at greater risk because of their mental health status? So this is at the BLS, and this is where you can get your data if you have that information, the number of work hours, etc. Okay. So now I'm going to move into risk assessment. I know I'm moving quickly, but I know you've heard of risk assessment before. I think Eddie said he hasn't done one lately, or in this context, but everybody knows what a risk assessment is. So I'm just going to walk you through, and I have some funny slides to do that with. So in a risk assessment, you have to identify your hazard. Okay, so if you're in a clinic and suicide is an issue, let's say you're you're dealing with a transgender population, ages 18 to 24. Suicide is one of the highest risk factors for them, okay? So you want to look at that information. You have to identify what the hazard is. What is the risk, or how is being a transgender individual affecting that person's life? They're getting beaten up, they're getting ridiculed, they're getting bullied. So these are all hazards in the life of that young person, right? And so you have to identify what the hazards are to that person. Of course, death is a hazard. And then you have to analyze the dose-response relationship. So and you can't always do this, but can you? So in the case of a clinic where, well, coronavirus, I mean, it's so timely. You know, if people kissed somebody who was a carrier versus stood in the room, you know, but wasn't talking with them or near them when they coughed, you know, you can establish a dose-response relationship. How much exposure do they have? Acquisition of scientific data, and that's simply to say, if there's a way to collect that data, you collect it, right? So if you're looking at suicide and at-risk youth, then you figure out how you're going to actually quantify that data, right? Not qualify it. And then you interpret the principles in the data. So those are your main steps in a risk assessment. The National Research Council proposed the Red Book paradigm, and they identified 4 steps in risk assessment, and it's basically what we just went over, okay? But they say risk characterization and exposure assessment. So this is what NRC considers the 4 steps of a risk assessment. Okay, and then we go through all 4 of those, right? And as you can imagine, they have effects on one another, right? So if you're doing a toxic exposure, for example, you measure toxicity. But if you're looking at a drug, and I will just say, I wish more people in clinical psychopharmacology were researchers, because we really need to build that part of our very unique field. You know, you're the only ones who can, I say only ones, but practically the only ones who provide weekly therapy, behavioral therapy, and could prescribe medication. And that, you know, there are some nurse practitioners, psychiatric nurses who will do that, but many of them, once they see you're on a stable path, they don't continue behavioral therapy so much, you know. So you're in a unique position, especially if you work Indian reservation, if you work with a specific population, to collect data. And if you have a lot of people who are suddenly having elevations in liver enzymes, or you know, showing a rapid decline in GFR, right? If they're having some kind of physical problem, you're in a unique position to assess that, as well as work with that patient on the behavioral components of developing hypertension or whatever, you know, whatever the outcome, you know, hepatitis, or not hepatitis, but hepatocellular cancer, you know, from these different markers. So you would do a toxicity assessment, right? Let's say their ALT and AST is 5 times what it was before they started the drug. You're going to do a toxicity assessment. You're going to follow up on, you're going to characterize the risk that, that this drug is affecting liver function, right? And you're also going to look at the exposure. Now, if you're doing a study and they're taking placebo and they're showing elevated ALTs and ASTs, you know that it's not the exposure per se that is responsible for that condition, or that outcome. It's not really a condition. but it could lead to a condition if you have chronic elevation of your liver enzymes. And so in doing all this, you identify what your hazard is, right? What is the drug causing this? And is liver failure the hazard? What is going to be the hazard? So that's kind of how we integrate these different tools. And this is occupational conditions. You know, there's issues with people who are in the field of welding and developing like a Parkinson's disease. There's all kinds of different occupations where you might use risk assessment, okay? And then I like this study, farming, hairdressing, and teaching are among brain risk jobs, okay? So this was a study that they looked at degenerative brain disease and looked at occupation. So talk about association versus causation, right? I can see if you teach, I'm shedding my skin here. If you teach and you have a lot of stress as a result of teaching, you know, is there an increase in brain disease? I don't know. But it could be. I mean, chronic stress is something that is associated with, you know, you flood your brain with norepinephrine over enough time, your brain is no longer going to respond to norepinephrine. So who knows? Anyway, so I thought this was interesting though, because they looked at a number of different kinds of occupations, and they found that there was an increased risk for degenerative brain diseases in these occupations. Okay, all right. So some of the reasons why you do risk assessment in psychopharmacology: in your pregnant patients, your elderly patients, if you have patients withdrawing from drugs or has withdrawn from drugs, polypharmacy. These are all situations when you are prescribers. If somebody comes in and sits down and says, I need medication to help me through this, you are doing a risk assessment, even if you don't call it that. But you have to rule out, is she pregnant for a lot of medications? Are they elderly? So why would you want to do elderly? Because their liver function is diminished, their kidney function is diminished, right? So their clearance and metabolism of the drugs is challenged, right? You have a patient on drug withdrawal. They may not be able to respond to the drug that you want to put them on, or they've already been taking and suddenly withdraw. Are they going to have seizures, right? If you have somebody who just jumps off of Oxcart, for example, right? So polypharmacy and pharmacogenomics. So all of these are factors or places where you would do a risk assessment on that for that patient, right? So just think about that from the standpoint of your upcoming practice, because I know you're all going to become prescribers. I'm going to do my best to make that happen. But these are things that you will do a mini risk assessment on for any of these factors. Gender, I didn't even put gender in. You know, but if you have a woman who has had breast cancer, right, or has breast cancer, your choice of antidepressant might be different, you know, or if somebody who's got hypercalcemia, right, so they've got elevated calcium levels, so they're hallucinating already, you know, so you have to determine whatever drug you're going to put them on is not going to increase calcium, right? If anything, you want to decrease calcium. So, all right, so risk assessment. What is risk? Now, you guys are all psychologists, so you know what risk is better than some people, but here's just a way to calculate risk. As probability increases, so do the consequences, okay? I just left Hawaii Island to live in Florida. So as I unpack all my dishes and things, I use this rubberized shelf liner because in earthquakes, it holds the dishes in place. They don't all spill out of the cabinets. But I did it here. I'm not at any risk for earthquakes here. Hurricanes has increased, but not earthquakes. So you have to take into account the probability or the likelihood of something happening, right? And the consequences of it. You know, I used to do earthquake outreach on Hawaii Island, and I'd go door to door and just check on people. This was for our adult mental health department out of the DOH. So I went to one family, and there was a little boy, and he was so scared to even talk about it, but he ran through the kitchen, and we had a 6.7 earthquake, and he ran through the kitchen, and all the dishes had landed and cracked on the floor, and he cut up his feet, okay? So to that little boy, the consequence was very high. It was so traumatic for him, right? But if he had slippers by his bed and had put on the slippers, the consequence of running through broken glass would have been much lower, right? So that's kind of the relationship between probability and consequences and how we assess risk. I hope that's clear. Okay, and then here's some examples of ways to calculate risks of seriousness times probability. And this is your overall risk table. So, vandalism and looting, the risk is not as great as like terrorist actions or earthquakes. Everybody's scared of earthquakes. I'll tell you, I'm glad not to be in a place where there's earthquakes anymore. And so this is just to give you an idea of how we calculate risk based on exposure. So risk increases as consequences times probability increases. So here's my example. You're standing there and you're looking at that tornado. Now, I've been in a building that was hit by a tornado, but I've never actually like stood there and watched it. Actually, I have. I watched a water spout come off of the Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico. I was a postdoc in Galveston. I was on the 10th floor of the building in the library, and we had all open windows. And I saw this water spout come off of the land, or come up off of the water onto the land, skip across the land, throwing trucks. And there were some RVs, recreational vehicles. And I watched this from my lofty position. I could see birds actually circulating in the water spout. And then it went off the island and went up the Houston Channel, right? Going up to Houston. I didn't feel threatened by it because it was far away. But if it had been heading towards me, I certainly would have increased the consequences and probability of it hitting me. Now, if you're standing there and you see a twister like this, a lot closer, right? You can probably feel the wind if you're outside. So here, the probability of it coming towards me is a little higher, and the consequences are higher too. Right here, that consequences and the risk is very high with this one. And here's this woman, she's from Oklahoma, and she's watching this thing, and she's just standing there with her hands on her hips. She has seen these things so many times that they just go right by. And so for her, she perceives the risk as much lower as I do. If I was that woman, I would be running the other way. Not that that would really make a difference if that thing was about to pick me up. but that's how I would respond to it, and that's risk perception. How does the person perceive the risk? Okay? And that's perceived risk, and this is actual risk, right? This guy might have been this woman at one time, living in a place where there's always tornadoes going by. But believe me, his perception of risk is forever changed. That's real risk or actual risk. Okay. So, oh, I see we've gone over already on our time. So why don't I stop here? And now is the lunch break, right? Yes, okay. So I will see you back here. So do I go up to the hour or should I just stop here? Do we take that extra 10 minutes off? It's up to you guys. All right. Eddie, you're fun. All right, we'll be back at 1 p.m. I'll see you all then. Thank you.